Reshit Chachma Yirat Adonai. Wisdom begins with fear of the Lord. Without God, look what happens. Without God, look what happens morally, intellectually, in terms of wisdom. And my biggest reasons for belief in God are watching what happens when people don't. So I'd love to have your reaction.
If you cease to believe in God, you'll start to believe in anything. That's a good way of looking at it. Catholicism, I've gone through lots of Catholic cathedrals in Europe, and of course they're stunning creations, but they're Gothic and strange, and the doctrine is eerie and complex and surreal. And the biblical writings are the same. Think of a book like Revelation, for example. But I think that the Catholicism, that's as sane as people can get, broadly speaking, is that we need a metaphysic, a narrative metaphysic to hold us together. And it has to be predicated on something that's transcendent and absolute. And if you lose that, then you'll fall for something else. You'll fall for something else. Or you'll fall for nothing, which is no better. And this is the problem with the rationalists like Sam Harris and the atheists, Dawkins. They believe that if we dispensed with our superstitions, we'd all become Harris and Dawkins. Rational beings devoted towards the good. I don't believe that, because I don't believe that we are rational beings fundamentally. I think we're deeply irrational. It's amazing that we can all sit in this room together without tearing ourselves into shreds. And then the issue of God as well is that there has to be something of fundamental worth. There is something that you consider of fundamental worth. Regard for other people, for the consciousness of other people, for the conscious being of other people, is in that realm. If you're going to have a relationship with yourself, if you're going to be able to love someone else, if you're going to be able to take care of your family and your community, you have to attribute to human beings a value that might as well be described as divine, given that it has to be the ultimate value that you hold. And it seems to me that it's not unreasonable to associate that value that is intrinsic in humanity with something that's metaphysically real, that's part of the structure of reality itself. And my sense has been, if you watch how people act when they're acting properly, the hypothesis that there is divinity within us that reflects divinity itself is the only conclusion that makes sense, that works. I think the evidence suggests that. You said, you look what happens when societies lose their bearings. It's like, that's what convinced me. To the degree that I became a religious person, wasn't as if I discovered God. It was more like I discovered Satan, or discovered the devil, and certainly believed that very powerfully. Metaphysically or not, you don't have to read that much about what happened in Nazi Germany or what happened in the Soviet Union or what happened in Maoist China, what continues to happen in many places around the world, to be convinced that there's a great darkness. And it seems to me that if there's a great darkness, then there has to be a great light. And the first part of that is true beyond any hope of refutation. And the second seems to be a logical necessity in the light of the first. Good is very difficult. It's by no means the default position. What's the default position? Entropy, catastrophe, tragedy, malevolence, and death. That's the default position. The good struggles up against that. That's no easy thing to manage. To think of that as intrinsic. It's an intrinsic possibility, but it's not something that you can manifest without faith and commitment. And the more faith and the more commitment, the better. And the deeper, the better. And it's the most difficult of things to do. And it's appalling to teach people the alternative. There's this old idea. You all know this idea. It's an idea that's expressed, for example, in the classic Disney movie, classic Disney movie, which I really like, called Pinocchio. And you know, when Pinocchio is attempting to free himself from the forces that manipulate him as a puppet and to become an autonomous being, he is required to go to the darkest place to find the worst monster and face that voluntarily. And in doing so, he rescues his father. And that's a very old idea. I don't know how old it is. It's one of the oldest ideas we have in written form, and there's no doubt that in its pre-written form it would be tens of thousands of years older than that. And it's a very strange idea that you have to journey to the darkest abyss to free the spirit of your father. But there's a reason for it, and it has to do with the tragic view of life, which is that you can't discover what you're capable of being or withstanding, and those are the same things, if you hide away from any of the things about life that are terrible but true. And the reason you can't discover who you are without doing that is that only necessity will force that out of you. We know now from a biological perspective that if you put yourself in new situations, in new and challenging situations, that new genes turn on in your nervous system and code for new proteins that produce new neurological structures. And so you can't even be what you are fully biologically unless you expose yourself to everything that you can expose yourself to as you journey through life. The old idea of a pilgrimage was predicated on that idea, as is walking in Chartres Cathedral, the labyrinth. The idea that you walk the labyrinth in Chartres and you come to the center is that you traverse every corner of the world, quarter by quarter, and then you come to the center. And the center is the center of the church, and it's the center of the crucifixion, it's the center of suffering. And you can't get to what that center signifies without having journeyed everywhere. And so the tragic view of life is necessary because it puts you on the journey that reveals to yourself who you could be if you were courageous as you could be and as truthful as you could be. And that's equivalent to discovering, to revivifying your dead father, because you are an ancient creature in some sense, and perhaps one with a spark of divinity inherent in it. But you will never release that unless you're willing to go everywhere that you have to go, because only necessity will call that out of you. And so you can't be happy. You can't be complete you can't know what you could withstand. You can't have any proper sense of self-respect unless you know what you can tolerate. And if you avoid everything that you have reason to avoid, but should nonetheless not avoid, you won't know who you are, and then you can't live properly. People ask me if I believe in God. I don't like that question. And so I sat and thought about it for a good while, and I tried to figure out why. And then I thought, well, you believe. I thought, who would have the audacity to claim that they believed in God if they examined the way they lived? Who would dare say that? To believe, you think, to believe in a Christian sense, to actually, this is why Nietzsche said there was only ever one Christian, and that was Christ. To have the audacity to claim that means that you live it out fully. And that's an unbearable task in some sense. To be able to accept the structure of existence, the suffering that goes along with it, and the disappointment and the betrayal, and to nonetheless act properly, right? To aim at the good with all your heart, right? To dispense with the malevolence and your desire for destruction and revenge and all of that, and to face things courageously and to tell the truth, to speak the truth and to act it out. That's what it means to believe. That's what it means. It doesn't mean to state it. It means to act it out. And unless you act it out, you should be very careful about claiming it. And so I've never been comfortable saying anything other than I try to act as if God exists, because God only knows what you'd be if you truly believed. I mean, if you think about it in some sense, that's the central idea in Christianity, is that if you were capable of believing, it would be a transfiguring event, a truly transfiguring event. And I know people experience that to one degree or another, but we have no idea what the limit of that is. And we have no idea what the possibility is within each person if they lived a life that was maximally courageous and maximally truthful. You know, because maybe you're running at 60% or 70% or 20% and at cross purposes to yourself. God only knows what you'd be if you believed. And so, while I try to act like I believe, but I'd never claim that I manage it, because it's a lot to manage properly, and you have to be careful about claiming to manage things that you can't manage. It requires work to maintain peace, and you can't be properly grateful unless you understand how unlikely it is that, well, we're not in the throes of World War III. We're not still in the depths of World War II. That the Cold War is mostly over. That the economic conditions of people everywhere on the planet are improving at a rate that could only be described as miraculous. And that most things are going in a positive direction. If you assume that that's normative, then you think, well, that's life. And you have no reason to have your eyes wide open in admiration and gratitude at the fact that the worst, which has frequently manifested itself, is not knocking at your door at this moment. Because that's the story of humanity, and not peace and prosperity. So here we have it, and here we should preserve it, and here we should spread it. We should do everything we can to live in a manner that makes that most likely. And we should do that because, well, you said, what did you say? Fear of God. It's like, throughout the Old Testament, you know, it's one story after another, is that people develop societies and they become arrogant and they wander off the path. And as soon as they wander off the path, all hell breaks loose. And if you're fortunate enough to be where all hell isn't breaking loose, you should do everything you can to help ensure that we stay the course and walk the straight and narrow path.